Should I use dynamic search ads or broad match keywords? It's a good question. Let's go ahead and talk about it. So, first thing, what do both do? Dynamic search ads, also known as DSAs, as I will refer to them. Both of them are going to utilize content from your site now to deliver relevant matches in regards to search terms. So that is one thing to keep in mind. They are both really, really great for data mining and basically expanding your reach on Google. They're also great for businesses that don't want to build like this huge list of keywords in their account. Now, that is to say, I think you should really put in the work to build keyword lists as needed. But regardless, it's also a good option for advertisers that just don't have like infinite amounts of time to build huge keyword lists. So totally understandable that you should probably hire an agency if you have a product catalog that's that large and a strategy that requires constant building of new keywords and optimizations around those keywords. But regardless, anyway, let's talk about one other thing before I go into some of the differences and when to use each and more of the details of each of those guys. So note that broad match in particular, it will use a user's recent search activities to determine whether they should show an ad for it. It's going to also, like I said, use the content of the landing page, and it's also going to use other keywords in the ad group to better understand keyword intent. So just something just to keep in mind when you're kind of structuring your ad groups, if you're going to put broad match keywords in a separate campaign from your phrase and or exact match keywords, which I definitely recommend that in most cases. Let's go into the differences. So the really fun stuff. So dynamic search ads in general are really good for if you have good, solid SEO on your site, search engine optimization. Now, in particular, in the technicals, in essence, if you have well-written HTML page titles and clearly written content, essentially Google's going to use those titles and like the most frequently used phrases on your site, wherever the landing pages are that you are giving it as a URL target, to select landing pages to use in your DSA ads, as well as to write headlines. Now, those headlines are also going to be based on the user's search intent, like what the user is searching, as well as text that feels it's like Google, it feels it's most relevant to the landing page or domain that you're sending the traffic to. So it is going to use all those things. It's going to use the content on your site to match to relevant queries. So obviously you want to make sure that when it does crawl your site, as they say, it's able to identify themes. This is really important, and terms that are on your site or the landing pages you're sending it to. So just quick note on that. As well, for Ecomm sites, it's a fantastic choice to use dynamic search ads, just in general, but especially for stores that have very large inventories or Ecomm sites with lots of new products constantly being developed. So a lot of product development, really good option for them, as well as if you have products that are going out of stock very frequently. Why this is because if you just had keyword-based, even broad match, keyword-based campaigns with no dynamic search ads, and you fit any one of those, breaking those down individually, if you have a large product inventory, that's a lot of keywords you got to keep up with, a lot of ad groups to optimize around. If you are dynamic search ads can keep crawling your sites, especially if you give it a URL target that's like rule based, that says if this word or this product name, for example, or this brand name is inside the URL, will allow this ad group and DSA campaign to send traffic to pages like that. So as new products are added to your site that have those in the URL, just as an example, it can make sure to continue and make sure to advertise those new products as they get added to the inventory. You don't have to constantly keep up with creating new ad groups, writing new ad copy, and building new keywords for those things, because that can be super helpful for those businesses. Now, to the point of if you have constantly products that are constantly out of stock or frequently out of stock, this can help you ensure that if Google recognizes the product is out of stock, it doesn't keep sending traffic to the site, though I have seen exceptions where it still does. Regardless, it can be good options for advertisers such as those. If you have a more conservative strategy, this is a little bit debatable, but if you lean more towards like lower tolerance for risk, DSAs over broad match can be a better fit, just because as long as your SEO is solid and all the things we've talked about are kind of in line and sort of well developed, in that case, you might get quicker results at a more, like, in terms of efficiency and profitability, much faster than broad match, because broad match may or may not go very, very wide in terms of what it matches to for search terms. It might take a longer time to dial that in with negatives and things like that. Now, this is not always the case, so huge disclaimer. Sometimes dynamic search ads goes even broader than broad keywords have historically in an account, or vice versa. So this is by no means all-encompassing, but it is just something to mention. If you lean a little bit more conservative in your strategies, you can't take a very long period of time before things are rather efficient, or maybe you just have a very small amount of budget. It might be a better fit to start with a dynamic search ad as opposed to broad match. But again, we'll talk later about broad match and whether or not it makes sense to do both or just one or the other. So next thing I'm going to say in regards to why DSA is a really good fit is going to be using the site to write ad copy across all of your entire catalog. As I mentioned before, this makes it really really easy to constantly have copy to promote new products that are being added to the site without you having to manually go in and write a headline for every single one. Now, you can, of course, you're going to put your own descriptions in there, but if you have an ad group that has more generic copy, or at least generic in the sense of for that product category that's in an ad group, that it's still going to make sense in most cases, and at least it can customize the headlines based on the titles and the words that are used on that new product page that you might launch on the site. So great for writing ad copy across a large catalog or even a small catalog. Also, it's great for testing multiple landing pages for a particular product category, right? So instead of having to just stick with like maybe one return RSA, a responsive search ad, in like a broad keyword match type campaign, you can have, like I said earlier, like a URL rule that says as long as this word or product name or brand name, whatever, is in the URL, go ahead and send traffic in this ad group to these pages, and then populate the ad copy for it. So it can be really great to kind of like see in your expanded landing pages reports in Google Ads which landing pages are doing well and which ones are not doing so well. That can also help with further segmenting your ad groups in the DSA campaign as needed, if you feel like it's appropriate. And then the last one's going to just be, and it kind of fits to that one, is sending users to the most appropriate product page on your site. So if they search for something, in a broad match keyword campaign is the only one that's being used and DSA is not being used, it may send it to that person to a page that's relevant, may not be such a relevant page for that person. DSA is going to be the closest, hopefully in most cases, to sending that person to the most relevant page on your site. So you can trust that a little bit more than with a broad match keyword. Now, broad match is really good for if you have poor, let's just say, SEO, search engine optimization on your site. It might be a better fit than a dynamic search ad style of ad group or ad type, because that is obviously going to need solid SEO, clear themes, search terms that Google can match to relevant search terms, etc. So if you've got poor SEO, I tend to not want to go with a DSA in that case. And you can also QA this in a couple ways. One is by throwing your site or certain pages of your site into Google's keyword planner and see what it spits out as a result. See if most of those terms are generally relevant, if they have some commercial intent words in there. If they're way off, or they just, you're like, I don't know what these terms are, what they mean, well, that is an indication that Google is not able to clearly identify what you're selling to some degree, but also that your SEO needs some work more than anything else. And DSAs are probably not going to be a good fit because those terms are likely to show up, not all of them, but those terms are more likely to show up in your search terms if you were to figuratively launch a DSA campaign or ad group. It's also obviously good for good SEO. If you have good SEO, you can also try broad match keywords because, as I mentioned earlier, broad match keywords are going to use and may use in some cases the content in your site to show to show ads to people it feels are relevant. Now, this is also kind of a disqualifier, as I mentioned, with the poor SEO, because if you don't have great SEO, I wouldn't have high hopes for broad match either. But again, if you're really just can't put for some reason work into your SEO and you really just want to do some kind of audience expansion via a search campaign, I would still lean more to broad than DSAs, but you still might run into issues with relevancy if that's SEO is not fixed. Also, just to throw it out there, really, really important, make sure that your core web vitals section of your search console, Google Search Console, does not have a bunch of like red URLs. And I just say that to keep it simple for you. If you go to the core web vitals section of your search console, you'll see red, yellow, and green. If you see a bunch of URLs that are like quote unquote failing URLs and they're in the red section, try to get those fixed. I know you can't always get all of them perfect to the yellow, but definitely try to do that to help with some of the SEO and the crawlability of the site, and make sure that all of your site pages, especially the ones that are most important to you, like your bestseller pages or best-selling categories, are not in the red, because that may or may not affect the search terms that you see, the relevancy of those, and how well Google does algorithmically with those campaigns and ad groups. So definitely keep those in mind. We'll get into some more tips in just a bit here. If you have well-recognized offerings, right? So if your products or services are something that is not probably new to Google, it's more than likely that Google has seen these types of things before. The more the better, like the more familiar the better. Broad match can be a decent fit, depending on how you set it up, which again, we'll talk about tips in just a bit. But, if it's a very niche product or you're a very niche just brand and Google does not, it's just not something Google is really going to be able to understand what you're selling because it probably hasn't seen it before. You might have some trouble with broad match, or Google might have some trouble with understanding what search terms are relevant, which searches to show ads for. Now, could it correct itself over time? Maybe. Is that risky? Definitely. So just do be careful about that if you have a brand like that or you're selling products like that. This also might be an argument for using broad match for some products and maybe not so much for others. Now, if you have a very aggressive strategy and your tolerance for risk is much higher than maybe a more conservative strategy, just in general, then in that case, broad match can be a good fit because broad match, it's going to more than likely be very broad in what kind of search terms it shows for, top of funnel, middle of funnel type of search terms. Expect to see all of those in there. So it can be great for really being aggressive in terms of expanding your reach and showing ads for more search terms that DSA might not be picking up on if you're running that on top of it, or that your other search keyword campaigns are not picking up with phrase and or exact match keywords or performance max, etc. I would also say in terms of broad match that it's really good for maximizing your ad messaging control. So if you really want to have hyper control over the exact headlines that go into your ads that are shown to users and searchers, obviously broad match can be a better fit than DSA because DSA is going to be basing that off of everything we talked about, whereas you won't be able to change the headlines like inside of Google Ads that DSA generates. With broad match, you have full control there. So that's also great if you want to use ad customizers to include things dynamically from a page feed, like inventory levels, like only 3 left in stock, something like that, where that number of stock inventory, that changes dynamically based on whatever values are in your product or you're in your page feed. Or if you want to do that, there's a lot of different ways that you could use ad customizers, even like including countdown timers for promos. You won't really have the ability to do that with dynamic search ads. So it is something also that's really great about using a broad match approach. So that pretty much covers it for those guys. I do want to go into now some tips. This will apply to both of them or individually when I call those out. So the first one's going to be testing in terms of tips is going to be testing DSA viability. So this is what I mentioned earlier. Check your core web vitals section of your Google Search Console. Make sure there isn't a bunch of important URLs that are failing, quote unquote. If they are, try to get those fixed before launching those URLs in a DSA campaign or ad group. Throw your certain pages or your entire site through Google's Keyword Planner. See the quality of terms that it shows you there might be a good way to QA whether DSA is going to be an appropriate fit for you, and broad match. And then make sure, obviously, that you have a well-structured site in all the ways that we talked about earlier. Now, just for broad match specifically, I would definitely recommend focusing on long tail broad match keywords. So this is going to be like four word plus keywords. So instead of, I very rarely do something like a 1, 2, or sometimes not even a 3-word broad match keyword because it's just going to be too generic. I really would want to put commercial intent words in there as well, like buy, sale, discount, whatever it is that makes sense for your business. Those are all words I'd want to really at least start the algorithm with, so it can find the most relevant search terms and not just go after this huge breadth of top, middle, and bottom of funnel searches. Now you can expand beyond that later, but at least to start, I like to start there. And sometimes I'll only stick with those depending on what I see in the search term reports. But definitely at the bare minimum, start with the long tail broad match keywords. Have each DSA and if you want to run broad match keywords in a separate campaign. Again, this is very debatable and very situational, but in most cases, I like to control bids and budgets, which are campaign only in terms of budgets. Setting, I like to control those separately. There's other campaign setting reasons why I'd like to have them separate, but in most cases, I do like to have my broad match keywords in a separate campaign than my phrase and or exact match keywords. And as well, I'd like to have dynamic search ads as a separate campaign as opposed to an ad group within non-DSA ad groups within a campaign. So those are just my tips on that. I mean, again, there's arguments for and against doing those things, but in most cases, I would recommend that. Now, I will just kind of say as a disclaimer that results may vary. DSA, as I mentioned earlier, could go super broad, more broad than a broad match keyword campaign. So just note that your mileage may vary, and you definitely need to test to see which works best for your account and for your business, and based on the bidding strategies that you're using and your keywords, et cetera. It'll be a lot of testing within these campaigns. Be prepared to add many negative keywords and exclusions if you're using DSAs in terms of URL exclusions, especially during the first few weeks after launch. Now, just be careful not to add too many top of funnel and kind of like middle of funnel search terms as negative keywords, because you might end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot there. There are cases where you want to give the algorithm some room, some fluidity there to learn. It might be able to get you better results long term if you give it some space and not just crowd it with a bunch of like really block it off with a bunch of negative keywords. So every business is going to be a little bit different. It's kind of more of a question of risk tolerance and how much time you can give it in order for it to get to a profitable level, or how fast you want to get a certain amount of conversions per month, for example. But anyway, those things will vary, but definitely be prepared to check your search term reports for both DSA and broad match keyword campaigns or ad groups. Next one's going to be with DSAs, make sure that you keep product categories, if that's relevant for you, separate at the ad group level and or the campaign level. So, I just wouldn't bundle everything into like one DSA campaign. You've got 6 different product categories or departments, and you're bundling them all into like an all web pages ad group. Don't do that. You want to control bids the most granularly at the ad group level or at the campaign level. And you want to be able to control those bids and budgets accordingly by your products and your business objectives, so that if you want to push certain products during the month of September, or you need to pull back certain products in December, you have that level of control in the campaign. You don't have to wait till that moment happens to segment and then optimize accordingly. Usually recommend getting ahead of it, having those things segmented as needed. Next one's going to be in terms of dynamic search ads. I just want to stress with the titles of your web pages, make sure that they have unique call to actions. Make sure that you keep the titles. This is per Google. Keep the titles and headlines on your site limited to 60 to 90 characters. Those are, again, Google's tips on for the titles of your site in order to help dynamic search ads do a good job. Keep all those things in mind. When not to use DSA, dynamic search ads. So if your site changes rapidly, like the example Google gives is like daily deals, Google does not, and I don't recommend that you have or that you utilize dynamic search ads for sites like that. So if the site changes very rapidly and very often, probably not a good fit. Now that's a loose definition, but I would just say if your pricing is changing every single day, dynamic search ads might not be a really good fit for you. Maybe not, but in most cases, I wouldn't recommend it. So next one's going to be DSA is not a good fit for any kind of page on your site that uses mostly Flash content or images. It's not going to do a good job because, again, it can't see the it doesn't understand the theme or it doesn't pick up on the content of your site, what it is, what are we offering, what search terms should I show ads for. It's not able to really recognize that. And then last is going to be DSA is not a good fit for sites that require users to sign in to access the bulk of the content on the site. That should be pretty obvious, but I've seen it happen. So usually accidentally. Last one I'm going to mention in terms of tips is going to be broad and DSA. Whether you use both or one or the other, I would lean towards using automated bidding. Why is that? Well, with both broad match and DSA, automated bidding or smart bidding, it's going to use real-time auction insights for bid optimizations. So it's going to essentially bid dynamically to reflect the intent of the searcher and whatever goals you've communicated to Google through your settings to, as Google likes to say, like, show up in the right auction at the right bid or the right price for the right person, the right user. So that's a really big advantage. Second is going to be query level, what Google calls query level performance modeling. That's just a fancy way of saying, bid more accurately on low volume or new keywords that are added to the account, the campaign, ad group, whatever it is. So essentially, it's going to use query level conversion data across the account to optimize and make sure that it's showing those lower volume or new keywords accordingly, or search terms rather accordingly. Third is going to be more contextual signals. I know they talk about this all the time, but essentially my favorites of signals that it uses that are not so obvious, like device location, those kind of things. It's going to bid based on the actual search terms that the person is. So not just limited to whatever keywords you fed it, but it's also going to use the searcher's words to bid accordingly. That may or may not be a good thing. Again, instead of just the keyword, it's going to use your product attributes to bid more or less aggressively for certain searches. And it's going to use price competitiveness, which is really cool if it has that data to bid dynamically. And it'll also utilize any seasonality trends that it recognizes to bid depending on what's going on in terms of seasonality. So those are some pretty cool signals you want to take advantage of that you won't have with more of a manual approach. And automated bidding just fits better, as you can imagine, with all the things we've talked about and the dynamic nature of these things and the wider reach of these things, why it makes sense to utilize that larger breadth of signals for it to do a good job with both DSA and or broad match keyword campaigns. Last thing I'll say on the subject, just to wrap it up, you can do both. Yeah, definitely test it. See what works best for you. You've probably been able to figure this out for yourself along the way, but there are cases where you want to do both. DSA to show ads for new products that are not built into broad yet. You can use DSA to fill the gaps of any keyword-based campaigns, phrase exact, broad match, etc. Some products you could do with DSA, other products you could do with broad match, depending on all the things that we've talked about, whichever seems like a better fit for you. And yeah, I know there's some predictions about DSA going away and it just being rolled up into Performance Max, but I don't really see that happening anytime soon, just because There are advertisers that really need a strong amount of control over negative keywords for brand protection or otherwise. So obviously, outside of brand lists, we don't have the ability to add very specific negative keywords to a Performance Max campaign, other than like communicating with a Google rep and seeing if rolling the dice to see if they'll let you do that, because you don't always get the option to do that in some cases. But yeah, definitely keep all that stuff in mind. I hope this was helpful for you, and we'll see you in the next video.